Vivid verses.
The completion gala for the Meridian Spire was meant to be the apex of a two-decade career, the physical manifestation of 10 million man-hours and 300,000 tons of reinforced concrete. Instead, it became the evening I mathematically decoupled myself from a partnership that had reached a terminal state of toxicity. The venue was a glass-walled ballroom on the 66th floor, a space I had designed to hover like a jewel over the neon grid of Singapore's Marina Bay. Below us, the city was a motherboard of light. Above us, the spire pierced the humidity of the tropical night. My daughter, Laylani, was the evening's secondary honoree. At 24, she had just secured a prestigious clerkship at the International Court of Justice, a feat that required a level of intellectual rigors few could sustain. She looked exceptional in a minimalist charcoal silk gown that mirrored the sleek lines of the building we were celebrating. She was the embodiment of poise, a testament to the success of a structured upbringing. This was her induction into the upper echelons of her field, and I had calculated every variable, from the guest list to the acoustic dampening of the room, to ensure the environment was frictionless for her debut. Nancy had different metrics for success. Her arrival was a choreographed disruption. She was 40 minutes late, a temporal insult to the ministry officials and senior partners waiting to begin the toasts. She didn't arrive alone. She was flanked by two associates from her Ascension Circle, a radicalized consciousness shifting group she'd joined 10 months prior. They were women named Saffron and Kaya, though I suspected those weren't the names on their birth certificates. They wore intentionally dissonant, shapeless linen tunics in shades of bruised purple and mustard, standing out against the sea of bespoke tuxedos and evening gowns like a calculated smear of oil on a blueprint. They didn't mingle in the traditional sense. They moved as a phalanx, a three-person cell of performative detachment. While the other guests discussed the spire's innovative seismic dampers and the revolutionary carbon sequestering glass we had pioneered, Nancy and her cohort moved through the crowd with an air of pitying superiority. I watched from the periphery as they dissected the oppressive verticality of the architecture. To Nancy, the spire wasn't a feat of engineering that provided housing and workspace for 5,000 people. It was a phallic monument to the ego, a scar on the celestial feminine. By the time the hors d'oeuvres, truffle-glazed wagyu tartare and caviar blinis, were being circulated by a waitstaff I had personally vetted, the disruption was no longer subtle. Nancy was pointedly ignoring the Ministry of National Development officials who had funded my firm's growth for nearly 2 decades. She remained huddled with her two shadows near the bar, making audible remarks about monuments to the fragile ego and the unbearable weight of patriarchal ambition. I observed her with the same detachment I used to analyze a stress fracture in a support beam. My internal processor noted the dilation of her pupils, the rapid, shallow cadence of her speech, and the way she gripped her glass of organic kombucha. She had stopped drinking colonized spirits months ago. She wasn't here to celebrate our daughter's achievement or my career's milestone. She was here to destabilize the system. The tension reached a critical mass when she cornered the Chief Justice near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood close enough to hear her lecturing him about the inherent violence of the judicial hierarchy and how his court was merely a theater for the enforcement of artificial boundaries. The Chief Justice, a man of immense patience and intellect, looked at her as if she were a curious meteorological phenomenon, unpredictable and ultimately destructive. It was at that moment I realized the social and emotional cost of her presence had finally exceeded the value of the marriage. The structural integrity of our union had been compromised beyond repair. I stepped toward their group. I did not rush. In my profession, haste is the father of error. I maintained a steady, non-threatening pace, my hands visible, my posture neutral. "Nancy," I said, my voice modulated to a precise, low frequency. "We should step out to the terrace for a moment. There is a private matter regarding the trust accounts that requires your immediate attention." She recoiled as if I had brandished a weapon, though I hadn't come within 3 feet of her. "Don't try to manage me, Alvin," she snapped. Her friends exchanged a glance, a 0.5-second micro-expression of rehearsed solidarity. They had been trained for this, the confrontation with the oppressor. "I am not managing you," I replied, keeping my heart rate beneath 70 beats per minute. "I am offering a discreet environment for a necessary transition. Shall we?" I reached out, not to grab her, but to gesture toward the soundproofed terrace doors. She seized the moment for maximum theatricality, realizing the room was watching. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked. The acoustics of the ballroom, which I had designed for perfect clarity, carried her voice to every corner of the 6,000 square foot space. "You think your wealth gives you the right to colonize my space? You're a sterile, controlling narcissist." The room entered a state of social paralysis. Conversations died in mid-sentence. The clink of silverware stopped. Laylani, who had been speaking with the Attorney General, went rigid. I saw her face pale, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of horror and a plea for intervention. I observed Nancy's frame. She held her chin high, her breathing shallow and triumphant. She was waiting for me to get angry, to plead with her to be quiet, or to attempt to lead her away by force, all of which would validate her narrative of my control. I did none of those things. I stood still and analyzed the situation. Probability of reconciliation, 0%. Social damage to Laylani, high, but mitigated by a decisive, calm resolution. Value of current domestic structure, negative. "Your assessment is noted," I said, my voice clear and utterly devoid of heat. It carried through the silence with the weight of a court ruling. "If you feel your space is being colonized, it is only logical that we terminate the arrangement. Since you find the monuments and the wealth offensive, you are now officially liberated from them. This evening marks the end of our cohabitation and our legal union." The smugness on her face didn't disappear. It flickered, a momentary glitch in her programming. She hadn't expected a summary judgment. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about autonomy, Nancy. The very thing you've been demanding in your circle meetings for the last 42 weeks. Effective immediately, the 4.5 million Singapore dollars discretionary fund is frozen. The penthouse lease in District 9 will be terminated at the end of the month. The supplementary credit lines, the Bentley's maintenance contract, the global health coverage, and the stipend for your artisan gallery. All of it is tied to the oppressive structure you just denounced. I am granting you the independence you've been performing." The color left her face, moving from the cheeks to the neck in approximately 4 seconds. Her friends, Saffron and Kaya, stopped smirking. They looked at the empty champagne flutes in their hands, as if realizing the fountain had just run dry. They were activists who traveled on my frequent flyer miles and ate at my table. Their radicalism was a luxury good, and I had just revoked the subscription. I turned to Laylani. My heart rate remained steady, but I allowed a slight softening of my gaze. She was the one variable that mattered. "Laylani, I apologize for the breach in decorum during your celebration. This is a structural failure that should have been addressed months ago. I will see you at the hotel later. Your mother and I are finished." Laylani nodded. Her eyes were wide, but there was a dawning sense of relief there. She had lived in the splash zone of Nancy's volatility for too long. I turned back to Nancy one last time. "You have the autonomy you requested. I suggest you use it to find a residence that aligns with your new values by the 31st. Good evening. To understand how I reached this level of clinical detachment, one must look at the data from the preceding 3 quarters. 10 months ago, Nancy was a sophisticated gallery curator with an eye for mid-century modernism and a sharp, cynical wit that I found refreshing. The change began when she joined the Ascension Circle. Initially, I viewed it as a harmless intellectual diversion. She had been restless after Laylani moved to The Hague for her studies, and I calculated that a new social circle would provide a necessary outlet for her energy. I was wrong. It wasn't a social circle. It was a psychological deconstruction site. The first anomaly was the linguistic shift. Nancy stopped discussing aesthetics and started using a jargon-heavy lexicon of resentment. If I mentioned a successful quarterly projection, she'd talk about extractive capitalism. If I suggested a holiday in the Maldives, it was colonialist leisure. If I bought her a piece of jewelry for our anniversary, it was a blood-soaked trinket of the patriarchy. I responded as an engineer would, with logic and system adjustments. I assumed there was a deficit in my own performance. I increased my contribution to household labor by 35%, taking over tasks she claimed were invisible labor. I attended her circle open houses, where I sat on floor cushions and listened to pseudo-intellectuals discuss the deconstruction of the domestic sphere. I practiced active listening, even when Nancy spent 3 hours explaining why my career in structural engineering was a phallic imposition on the landscape. I treated her complaints as feedback loops, adjusting my behavior to optimize the system. It didn't work. Each adjustment was met with an escalation of the rhetoric. The more I yielded, the more oppressive I became in her narrative. It was a paradox. My very willingness to accommodate her was framed as a subtle form of gaslighting. The inflection point occurred 6 weeks ago. My nephew, a brilliant boy who had just won a full scholarship for a PhD in quantum computing, was sharing his news over dinner. He was excited, talking about the potential for subatomic processing. Nancy had laughed, a cold, brittle sound, and said, "Another male mind focused on building machines to further the surveillance state. How predictably unoriginal. You're just another brick in Alvin's wall." The boy's humiliation was palpable. He looked at his plate, his pride extinguished. I apologized to him later, but I realized then that Nancy was no longer exploring ideas. She had been subverted by an ideology that required the dehumanization of those closest to her. She was no longer a partner. She was a saboteur. The final data point came 2 weeks before the gala. I had been awarded the Golden Compass for architecture, the highest honor in the region. When I told her, she didn't even look up from her tablet, where she was reading a manifesto on the end of ownership. "I wonder how many women's careers were paved over to make that trophy," she remarked. She didn't know, or care, that my lead design team for the Spire was 60% female, or that I had mentored dozens of young architects regardless of gender. Facts were irrelevant to her. Only the narrative of my villainy mattered. She needed me to be a monster so she could feel like a martyr. That night, I performed a cold-eyed audit of the marriage. 26 years. We had built a life across 3 continents, raised a daughter who was a credit to our names, and navigated the complexities of high-stakes careers. But the woman I married was gone, replaced by a vessel for someone else's bitterness. The Nancy variable had become a constant negative, dragging the entire equation toward zero. I spent the next 14 days in strategic preparation. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. While she was at her circle meetings, I met with Marcus, a top-tier family lawyer who specialized in high-net-worth disentanglement. We worked to ring-fence my premarital assets and my performance bonuses. I moved 1.2 million Singapore dollars into a separate, irrevocable trust for Laylani, ensuring her future was insulated from whatever wreckage Nancy might create. I secured a high-end, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet, modern building in District 11. I didn't just plan to leave, I planned a structural relocation. The night after the gala, the reality of the independence she'd championed began to settle into the penthouse. The air felt heavy, charged with the ozone of an impending storm. I was in my study, methodically packing my collection of rare architectural blueprints and my grandfather's antique drafting tools. Nancy entered the room. She was no longer wearing the linen tunic. She was in a silk robe I had bought her in Paris, back when we still spoke the same language. Her movements were agitated, her frame beginning to crack. "You're actually doing this. You're leaving me because I spoke my truth at that ego fest." I didn't stop packing. I wrapped a brass protractor in acid-free paper. "I am leaving because you have redefined truth to mean the public humiliation of your family. You made a choice to prioritize a performance over a partnership. I am simply validating that choice. We've been together for nearly 3 decades, Alvin. You can't just compute me out of your life like a faulty variable." I looked up then. My expression was as neutral as a concrete wall. "Actually, that is exactly what I can do. In engineering, a system that consistently produces negative output despite repeated corrections is defined as a failed system. To continue investing in a failed system is not loyalty, it is irrationality. I am cutting my losses." She tried to pivot to a different emotional frequency, vulnerability. "Where will you go? You're a creature of habit. You'll be lost without this house, without our life." I pulled a document from my blazer, which was draped over the chair. "This is the lease for my new residence. I've already moved my personal effects and my library. The utilities here are paid through the end of the month. After that, the account reverts to your name. Given your public disdain for my extractive income, I assume you have a plan to sustain this 18,000 Singapore dollars a month lifestyle on your own. It would be hypocritical to do otherwise, wouldn't it?" She stared at the document, her jaw tightening. The reality of the numbers was finally piercing the veil of her rhetoric. "You've been plotting this. This is financial abuse. You're using money to punish my ideology." "No," I corrected, my tone clinical. "Financial abuse is the forced control of another's resources. I am simply withdrawing my resources from someone who views them as a tool of oppression. You are now free from the taint of my money, Nancy. This is what you said you wanted. This is the autonomy your circle celebrates. I am giving you exactly what you asked for." She sat on the edge of the bed, the bravado finally fracturing into something smaller, something sharper. "I don't have enough in my personal account to cover the HOA fees, let alone the mortgage and the staff." "Then you must adapt," I said. "Sell the gallery pieces I bought for you. Find a smaller space. Or perhaps your Ascension Circle friends will provide for you. Saffron and Kaya seemed very enthusiastic about your liberation last night. Surely they have a guest room." I finished the last box and sealed it with reinforced tape. The sound of the tape stripping from the roll was the only noise in the room for a long minute. "The divorce papers will be served on Monday. I've instructed Marcus to be fair but firm. Do not attempt to gaslight me regarding our history, Nancy. I have logs of our conversations for the last 6 months. I have the video from the gala, which clearly shows you shrieking, 'Get your hands off me,' when I wasn't touching you. I have a clear, documented record of your trajectory. My frame is quite secure. Yours, however, is collapsing. By dawn, I was in my new apartment. It was on the 20th floor, high enough for a view, but low enough to feel connected to the street. It was quiet. The air was cool and filtered. No more walking on eggshells. No more linguistic landmines. No more waiting for the next deconstruction of my character. I prepared a simple breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee. There was no one there to comment on the patriarchal origins of the spice trade or the carbon footprint of my caffeine addiction. I felt a profound sense of equilibrium. My phone remained on Do Not Disturb, but the notifications were a steady stream of digital noise. Pleading texts from Nancy, ranging from "I'm sorry" to "You're a monster," indignant emails from her sister in London, and "What happened?" messages from colleagues who had witnessed the gala meltdown. I ignored them all. I had already delivered the necessary information. Any further engagement would be redundant. 3 days later, Laylani arrived at my new place. She looked around the minimalist space, her eyes lingering on the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked toward the harbor. "It's very you, Dad. Very structured. I find structure promotes clarity," I said, pouring her a glass of chilled mineral water. She sat down on the leather sofa, sighing deeply. The stress of the last 72 hours had left shadows under her eyes. "Mom is a wreck. She's telling everyone you've had a psychological break, that you're punishing her for being an empowered woman. She's trying to get me to testify for her in the divorce. And do you believe I've had a break?" "No," Laylani said, looking me in the eye. "I was there. I've been watching her for months. It's like she's been brainwashed by those women. She told me yesterday that I was a traitor and a handmaiden to the patriarchy because I wouldn't move into a communal house with her and Saffron." She shook her head. I told her I'm 24 and I have a job in another country. She didn't even hear me. She just kept talking about shared energetic spaces. Her internal narrative is now a closed-loop system, I explained. She filters all data to support her conclusion that she is a victim and I am the oppressor. There is no room for external reality in that system anymore. To acknowledge your career or my support would be to crash her program. "But it's so sad," Laylani whispered. 26 years just gone. How do you just turn it off?" "It isn't gone," I said, sitting across from her. "Those years were an investment that yielded a fantastic daughter and a period of genuine partnership that I will always value. But every asset has a life cycle. This one has reached its end. I am not punishing her, Laylani. I am simply stopping the subsidies. If she wants to live in a world without the oppressive structures I provide, she has to actually live in it. I am treating her as the autonomous adult she claims to be." Laylani looked at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and a strange kind of admiration. "You're so cold sometimes, Dad." "I'm not cold," I told her. "I'm disciplined. If I reacted with anger, I would give her the conflict she craves to feel alive. If I gave in, I would be enabling her destruction of my peace. This is the only logical path for all of us. You will see. Within a year, the noise will stop." As the weeks passed, the social ripples in Singapore's tight-knit architectural and legal circles settled. The video of the gala meltdown had indeed circulated, but the consensus was not what Nancy had hoped for. In our social circles, dignity is the highest currency. To disrupt a daughter's achievement with a political screed was viewed as a profound lapse in judgment, a structural failure of character. My reputation for being unshakable only grew. I was the man who had fired his own wife at his greatest triumph because she had forgotten how to be a person. The Ascension Circle crumbled shortly after. It turns out that when the members' husbands stopped funding the Enlightenment workshops and the $500 a session energy clearings, the circle lost its gravity. Nancy's two friends, Saffron and Kaya, were the first to vanish. They didn't want to live in a communal energetic space if it meant a 2-bedroom condo in a non-prime district without a pool. They were scavengers, and the carcass was picked clean. The divorce was finalized in 7 months. I was precise with the numbers. I didn't want her destitute. That would be a failure of my own internal code. But I wouldn't fund a lifestyle she had publicly spat upon. She received a fair settlement, enough for a comfortable condo and a modest life. But the luxury penthouse, the chauffeured cars, and the social standing were stripped away. She had to find a job. She eventually landed a position at a small nonprofit, earning a fraction of what her monthly discretionary fund used to be. Today, I stand on the terrace of a new project, a high-altitude garden in the heart of the city. I am looking out over a different skyline, one that I helped shape. I am at peace. My daughter is a rising star at the ICJ, and we speak every Sunday without the shadow of drama or the need for linguistic translation. We speak of law, of logic, and of the future. Nancy is still in the city. I see her occasionally at events, though she usually avoids my line of sight. She looks different now, thinner, less vibrant, her truth having proven to be a cold companion in a small apartment. But perhaps this life is more authentic to her. She is no longer colonized by my success. People often ask if I regret the abruptness of the end, the clinical way I severed the cord. I tell them that in engineering, when you find a fundamental flaw in the foundation, a crack that goes all the way to the bedrock, you don't keep building. You don't try to patch it with sentiment or wallpaper it with memories. You stop, you clear the site, and you start again with better materials. My self-respect was the only material I needed to keep. The rest was just debris.
Thanks for listening.